Ta-da. Hello, beautiful community. Hello, beautiful community. Are you hearing me? Are you hearing me? Good evening, Larry. Good evening, Michael. Let's take a couple of questions from the top if everybody's able to hear me clearly. Something weird keeps happening, but questions are disappearing from the top of the chat section by the time I log in that I seem to have noticed there before. I'll try to reflect on that a bit. I don't love doing lives on the main channel, even though they generate a bigger audience. But we just need to reflect on why there are these little things glitching up. Question that's disappeared is actually a question I probably can't take about the knowledge of Soviet citizens on the day-by-day level about what was happening during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I know that Sergei Radchenko, who you can follow on Twitter, is a wonderful expert in this area, and I think he and I were on the same radio program a couple of weeks ago on BBC Radio Wales. I'd love you to delegate Cuban Missile Crisis questions in another direction. In terms of my contribution, the judgment that I make about this is that Putin's psychology about global nuclear war is a little closer to something a bit more nihilistic and a bit more akin to the psychology of fundamentalist terrorism than it is to the psychology of either Kennedy or Khrushchev. That's to say, today, Scholz and Macron are in the same psychological boat as Khrushchev and Brezhnev, and all four, for instance, are in contrast with how Putin thinks about it. The difference isn't night and day, but it's there. And that's really an important distinction. I'm so glad you're all exercised by how hot the planet is getting. Mr. Man Buzz, Vlad, is it fair to hold the depoliticized blob in contempt? I know that's not a constructive position. Is it a fair one? Look, first of all, nobody's going to come and arrest you for thinking whatever you want to think about Russians or about any other country or culture in the world. So it's not an illegal thing. I don't love to put burdens on you that outrun your own personal sense of how many psychological and intellectual resources you're allocating to something, right? If you're saying, I'm only going to put one egg in that basket, I don't want to speak to you as though we're putting 20 eggs there, and then we debate what 5 should be, what the other 5 should be, and so on and so forth. So I want to be careful with you on that. I suppose you want to go there to some extent if you're asking the question. And the truthful answer is that we are right here in a growth channel. This is a growth channel. The main channel is a growth channel. Now that sounds an egregious thing to say, because there is so much about the growth industry today, the personal development industry, that is antithetical to growth and antithetical to the development of the human personality. And that is why so many growth gurus are immature men who might be sort of financially secure, but they can't emotionally tie their shoelaces. But this is a growth channel. And of course, the answer is going to be a growth answer. So what you should think about the depoliticized blob in the middle, or about any other thing about matters in your society or in different parts of the world, is about, is the position you're taking, is the vantage point you're taking conducive to your own growth? And growth means not just change, but it means both enrichment and a little bit of personal upheaval too, right? Upheaval of beliefs, upheaval of ways of looking at things. So if what you're doing feels very static to you, it's not adding anything to your life, it's a kind of a closed, dead position, I would say that's less good. But if it's something through which you're growing, you're exploring your own ethical reactions to the world, you're questioning, you're always alert to whether or not your outlook might not, in fact, be based on falsehoods that you didn't consider were there before, right? So, are you moving from a present to a future state with this kind of situation, or is it like this, right? So somebody who sits on the internet and types in orcs, orcs, orcs from Montreal, having never been to Ukraine, that's almost never going to be conducive to any kind of growth in the way one thinks about, um, you know, in the way one thinks about the world around one. Lucas is asking, how would the Ukrainian victory impact other countries like Georgia and Moldova? That simply depends on whether you package a Ukrainian victory together with the end of the Putin regime. And one of the most disconcerting messages that my analysis leads one to is that you can't entirely decouple the two, at least in the sense that if Putin loses Crimea, right, which doesn't look on the cards now, but anything can happen, certainly doesn't look on the cards now. But if Putin loses Crimea and manages to keep power, he's going to have no interest in stopping the war, right? And so um, we are in this peculiar situation of potentially understanding that the Putin regime is married to this war, right? And this, I think, comes in to Valeria's question. Hi, Valeria, great to see you. Um, question: how can we be sure we can't? How can we be sure that Putin wants to actually go to war with the West in a few years? Shouldn't the Ukraine disaster teach him a lesson about his forces? So I think that my analysis is in the opposite direction, right? So unfortunately, the worse things go for Putin, the more he's convinced that Ukraine isn't real, that NATO is a disaster, and that it is Russia's destiny to, via Putin, shake up the international order and sort of emerge from the very back row onto the forefront of international affairs. Now, that analysis is part of, I think, it has to come with two stories. One story has to be about intent, but psychological intent is never enough. And that's a conversation of what's actually in Putin's mind. And the second lane has to be, are there institutional or at least collective processes at work that are locking the Putin regime into something like the mobilization of society or the movement toward the mobilization of society for a big conflict with the West in years to come? Is this something we can derive from Putin's conception and the conception of Patrushev and Kovalchuk's and others around him of what regime security means for Russia? Is it the case that they think that unless they go in that direction, they're going to destabilize the regime in a way that they can't afford to do at home in the years to come? So it's going to be a conversation about what processes are at work and what conceptions are at stake. And if you want to sort of a reference to something factual, of course, one thing to look to is Putin's pre-war ultimatum, which was all about a level of proprietorial control over Eastern Europe that was incompatible with the existence of NATO in anything like the kind of form that it could realistically take. So that's the mold in which the answer might come. A couple of tiny announcements. Um, Obviously, you know about my health, and in that context, it's very nice that in the last couple of weeks, both channels hit 10 million views in the last year and a half. Second announcement, I have finally succumbed to the requests to read through Peter Pomerantsev's um, article in The Guardian, which got praised and um, critiqued heavily. And the article basically said that there is something destructive about what Putin is doing, that that's somehow to do with Russian culture, and that that destructiveness is sort of self-perpetuating, a kind of destructiveness for destructiveness sake. And um, the reason I was um, resisting doing that is simply because I don't want to sit in front of you and give people scores out of 10 for how they've done. Um, and it's not it's not an easy, and it's quite a coercive enterprise to write a short article. Um, but the only way I can justify talking about that with you is if I myself give something that Peter gestures at but doesn't give in that article, which is a psychoanalytic, a sketch of a psychoanalytic account of Putin's intolerance of Ukraine, of Putin's incapacity to bear the very existence of Ukraine. So unless something cataclysmic happens, that's probably going to be the next video on chat, and it's going to be a long one, and it's gonna partly cover this business of how much is this about Russian culture, but it's also going to cover, for the first time ever, I actually believe, in any media form, psychoanalytic speculation about Putin's incapacity to bear Ukraine. All Peter does in that article, which I skimmed, but we'll read it together slowly, is bring in Freud's idea of the death instinct, um, an idea that in many ways obstructed Freud's own thought, one must say. But it's a nugget for which Peter got rather roundly mocked in some circles for saying, all Russians are bad because Freud told me so. Um, we'll assess that, and I think it'll be a really interesting sort of joint um, session where we not just explore these questions, but explore how we react to um, an interesting and challenging and controversial and maybe even sloppy article by someone we generally like. I think that's very important because we're always trying to do process, right? We're not just trying to say who's right, who's wrong. Um, how does I can't comment about the grain deal. Is just going to outstretch my legitimate area of expertise. Um, um, I think that so the question is, how does Putin's grain deal affect his influence in the global south, as he'll be hugely affected by it? Um, I think that both Russia and Ukraine are in a position where they're reaching for some mechanisms of and diplomatic means of mitigating this situation. But it's not a question I can answer. At the level of discourse in Moscow, Putin is under considerable pressure to not have a grain deal on um, from the Z radicals. And he's himself sufficiently persuaded that it's a good thing for him to put Ukraine in this deleterious position. Um, so, um, does that mean that you can't have some kind of constructive outcome? No, because that depends on Russia's dealings with Turkey. And again, the innards of that probably outrun my expertise. So I'm very, very politely ducking um, away from the substance of that question. Hi, Jessica. Hi, Robert. What are global trends that go against uh, Putin's agenda that he has no control over? Well, the fact that Putin's, to some extent, a puck in a rivalry between two giant powers, the United States and China. Um, you could call Russia's relationship with China increasingly a global pattern over which Russia does not have as much control as any responsible re- government or regime would want. And if you're talking about truly global patterns, um, one example, of course, is that Russia's regime is predicated upon the world not turning to face the challenge of the climate crisis properly. And Alexander Etkind has gone as far as to argue that disrupting Western climate policy is itself one of the aspirations of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Right? So, in that sense, um, Russia is. I'm not sure how much I love that expression. We'll analyze it when we talk about Alexander Atkins' book. But in that sense, Russia is at war with modernity. Not that it follows from this that, of course, Western policy on the climate crisis is remotely efficacious at the moment. It isn't. It wasn't me is asking, do Russian soldiers know um, how that? Do Russian citizens know how Russian soldiers are being treated in the army? Um, I think what's fascinating about that question is that the answer is probably yes, but that all too often that concern, and nobody's been clear about this in Greg Uden recently, is directed at regional governance. So that concern is directed at local governors rather than at the Kremlin, which creates a kind of further feudalization of the Russian military, interestingly. Um, we shouldn't overstate this, but it does add to this sense of there being a kind of multiplicity of armies that are coordinating together into the Russian army rather than one army in the sense in which, let's say, a very bureaucratically functional country might have it. Oscars, your question about the ethical implications of human cloning as a solution to demographic problems is interesting because, first of all, it raises questions about what you think about population crises and in which direction you're assuming we've got a crisis. Um, but then it raises philosophical questions that I think I have to challenge us to think about more on the philosophy channel. Leopard is talking about Russian literature and how not much has changed. I think um, it depends on what you want to take from it. Um, there's another article by a Ukrainian philosopher, Mr. Yermolenko, that I've also been asked to read about the connection of Russian culture and the war. So I'm sure as part of that, we'll have this um, conversation. I think that we've got to be careful about making links between 19th century Russian literature and the Putin regime. Um, they are more unconstructive than constructive, these kind of links. Moreover, they often confuse us about which mode of explanation is appropriate to make sense of what's happening. And there is also a risk of misrepresenting Ukrainian voices here, because as much as there are a lot of folks in Ukraine saying Putin's war is just a product of Russian culture, there are also voices that are arguing against that. You're not necessarily going to hear them on Twitter, but they're there. And so, one of the themes that's developing for me very clearly is the importance of respecting Ukrainian agency, not just on the soft on Putin's side. We often complain how Mr. Chomsky and Mr. Mearsheimer didn't respect Ukrainian agency, but I actually think we need to respect Ukrainian agency more, including the plurality of discourse in Ukraine, which should not just be recognized but encouraged. That we need to respect Ukrainian agency more ourselves on the pro-Ukraine side. Um, that's very important, it seems to me. Hello, Sleeping Beauty. Rachel, so grateful to you for doing helpful things in the chat. Um, one of the strange features, right? I'm talking about Elise's question about sort of losing bits of Russian literature, is that um, if you ask me, is Russia a European country? Obviously, the answer has got to be unsettled in some respects, but there is one respect in which it has to be settled, and that's that Russian high culture is completely European. There's no doubt about that. All Russian art, music, all Russian literature is European. It's a branch on the tree called European literature. Right? Dostoevsky is a branch on the tree called European literature. You can't cut that branch off without cutting other bits of that tree, without damaging that tree. Same goes for Russian music and Russian painting too. The problem then arises, how does that high culture relate with the rest of Russian culture? And that's, of course, an important conversation for another time. Tony, do you want to read some of a couple of Isaiah Berlin's essays on Tolstoy? They appear in his collection, Russian Thinkers. Hi, Gabriella. Roy is asking, in the Russian mind, well, there's no such a thing as the Russian mind. Um, but that doesn't mean you can't make cultural generalizations and psychological observations about that culture too. So I want to push back against you, but not all the way. That's important. We'll say much more detailed and interesting things about that tomorrow, probably when we talk about Peter Pomerantsev's article that a couple of people have been so insistent that I read. What's the moral argument being made to justify the invasion of Ukraine? So for the vast majority of Russians, The war is something that proceeds via mm, a kind of inferred conception of justification. That's to say, the war is something Mr. Putin is doing for reasons that aren't available to us. Hopefully, he wouldn't do it unless he had good reasons for it. That's how those in the blob in the middle who would want to say that probably it's the right thing to do um, would think about it. It would not be, this is why it's right. It would be, we have no idea what the reasons for this are, but our politics is outsourced to the Kremlin. I mean, it'd be an utter calamity if they had no idea what they were doing. And this is a pretty extreme thing to do. Um, Surely they wouldn't do that. Surely they wouldn't do that without good reason. Now, if you're asking me what the justification is among the sort of feverish imperialists, um, it's what we could call an atypical colonial story, which is to say that it's not really a colonial story about domination and civilization of an inferior culture. These Z radicals do not think Ukrainians are inferior to Russians. Um, they don't recognize them as others at all. They just think that they're Russians who've lost their way. To some extent, via what they would that they would perceive as a malign foreign interference by the United States. So the story there is that Ukrainians are suffering from false consciousness, according to these Russian Z radicals and propagandists. Now, could you imagine that a lot of people are fully convinced and unironic about that position? No. There would have to be quite a bit of alienation that most people who hold that position feel from this view. And there've got to be a bit of embarrassment about that too. But it's certainly something that many of the Z radicals have believed. They believe that there's no difference between Ukrainians and Russians, and sort of Ukrainian culture is just a bit of Russian culture that is being siphoned off by the evil West. Um, so that is, as I think I tried to explain briefly in one of the videos in the main channel, in direct contrast to how Russians would view Chechnya, um, where they would see it as an inferior culture that needs to be civilized. Vegela, thank you so much. Or Hans. I missed a super chat from Ohms. Thank you. I missed a couple of questions. Here is one from Blue Hawk. Kotkin has defined, the wonderful historian Stephen Kotkin has defined Russia as culturally European, but not institutionally European. Much like how Japan is culturally not European, but institutionally European. Well, Russia is certainly not institutionally European. I think that Russia is at a cultural remove from Europe that is notable. In other words, the gap culturally between, let's say, Britain and Russia is much greater than the cultural gap between Britain and France. But at the same time, as soon as you begin a conversation about political institutions in Russia, it's hard to avoid, once you ask proper questions, to immediately turn toward what you've called European institutions. And this raises a very important question. How far are European institutions just anyway the only legitimate form of government available in the world today? And by that, I don't mean that you've got to be like Germany, or like Finland. I rather mean that you've got to have an election cycle, you've got to have courts that work, you've got to have a modicum of freedom for the press and so on. Are these elementary political items part of a sort of ineliminably minimal goodie bag that has to go with any idea of what makes a legitimate regime in the modern world? Um, and where do you draw the line, and how is that line drawn? Um, I think this is a very important conversation. My argument would be there are some elementary bits of liberal democracy, not all the bits, but some elementary bits that it's hard to resist, no matter what society you're talking about, right? Whether it's Denmark or North Korea. That's the beginning of that conversation. Um, Grateful to you, Christopher. I am feeling like I am missing some super chats. Let's have a look. Yeah, I've just missed the super chat. I can't explain why that has happened. Let's have a look. If I can find it again. We just got to get this channel to 100,000 for this extra functionality. Um, mm, Hayo is asking, Vlad, you told us Prigozhin does not have a social basis different from Girkin. When and how has that changed? Um, I think that some of the weighings I gave on this were misweighed and mistimed. Girkin comes with a certain level of organicity. So there's really a kind of Z bubble that he fairly naturally represents. What we have learned, certainly during the mutiny, is how disciplined Girkin is in aligning himself with the Kremlin when a situation of uncertainty develops. The difficulty with the Prigozhin story and this business of misweighing it and mistiming it is that the game Prigozhin was playing is the game Putin wanted him to play. And Prigozhin was not, unlike Girkin, engaging in the mobilization of a political movement. What he was engaging in to begin with was, if you like, the formalization of his power. As one wonderful commentator put it, he wanted to be not just the man standing by Putin's shoulder at the table, but the man now with a seat at the table of Putin's politics. Prigozhin served Putin's interests by attacking the Ministry of Defense. It was very important for Putin that Prigozhin did that. But this dynamic got out of control. It's an age-old peacetime dynamic. And by peacetime, I mean pre-full-scale invasion of Ukraine time, but also pre any kind of invasion of Ukraine time. This was happening from the first few years of Putin in office, where Putin was outsourcing power to folks around him, seeing them engage in various kinds of enterprise and conflict, and coming in to referee that conflict. All that happened to begin with was that Prigozhin was serving that kind of function. He was having a conflict with the Ministry of Defense of the kind that has happened hundreds of times within Putin's court or within Putin's plurality of courts. Under the conditions of war, this began to get out of control. And that's why, funnily enough, you had an interesting dynamic where some of the less informed people were overstating Prigozhin's case as somebody who could potentially threaten Putin's power. And then some people with a deeper understanding of Russia, funnily enough, were understating Prigozhin's case because what they were seeing was so clearly a continuation of patterns they were familiar with, which people who knew less about Russia weren't familiar with simply because they weren't following the country much before the war. Having said all of this, what I would say about Prigozhin's mutiny is that it was directed at Putin. So I disagree with people who say it wasn't directed at Putin, but it wasn't directed at Putin with a view to overthrowing Putin. And that has understanding that has the effect of leaving us not entirely surprised by some of the ways they're trying to resolve this, including the meeting that Prigozhin and Putin have had. And it's a wonderful question. And I think it very nicely exposes how I mistimed and misweighed my Girkin Prigozhin commentary. And I'm delighted to point that out because fundamentally what I go all in with is the most global observations, right, about the state of democracy, about the stability of authoritarian regimes, about some historic principles of operation of the Putin regime. And we always try to derive these conclusions out of sometimes following the micro maneuvers of these alliances and these people. But I really think your question is excellent. Paul is saying, Vlad, thanks for helping to reawaken my political understanding. I found your analysis coincided with my experiences in Russia and Ukraine. My pleasure. But I am disappointed and conscious that there are several super thanks that I've missed. Here is one that I found from Ogdin Emporium. Vlad, if you could fantasize for a minute and really go for it, how would you go about getting the Russian population to rise up? An absolutely apocalyptic set of open conflicts within the elites, followed by constructive mobilization by Russian oppositional groups. So, some of the people who were sympathetic to Prigozhin's mutiny, in a way more than Prigozhin himself was, making various moves, for instance, and that becoming public. So it's going to be bottom up and top down, probably with something top down happening first, sort of palpable cracks in the regime, which mean that normalization becomes impossible. Patrick, do you see any major similarities, differences between the Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, special military operation, and the Kursk submarine catastrophe in terms of how Russian people reacted to the events and how Putin handled them? What happened to Kursk Putin was asked, "It drowned," he answered. Um, and there is a conversation about Russian regime not asking for international help and they've been available. I mean, there are going to be plenty of continuities. Continuities about indifference to um, death toll. That's something about which I remain a pessimist as a destabilizing factor. In other words, I think that Russia has not um, mm, traversed more than 10-15% of its capacity to put soldiers into the meat grind of the war. Um, at the same time, this is a Putin with some differences. Um, this is a Putin with fewer things holding him back. This is a Putin with a sense of mission. This is a Putin with a kind of unfathomable incapacity to process wounds he feels the West and grievances he justly feels his experience in his relationship with the West, wounds the West inflicted upon him in his perception, his um, obstructed paranoid perception. We'll talk a lot more in detail about that tomorrow. So Putin's sense of mission is new. His psychological degeneration is new. The degeneration of Russia's political system is new. Obviously, it would be a stretch to go in the direction of a conversation. Well, at which point was something like this inevitable? Um, I began to think of a major Russian intervention around 2015, perhaps after the beginning of the war with Ukraine, but not a full-scale war. And at that time, I was thinking of an intervention in the Baltics as something that was feasible. And I do think that a more sober Putin may have either waited longer or started with the Baltics or both. Um, so that was something that was a concern for me. Ollie, do you think Putin experiences any cognitive dissonance reconciling seeing Russia as a great power versus the kleptocracy he must know it is? So Putin thinks that Russia ought to be a great power, but he thinks that it isn't. It needs to establish its status as a great power, and that's his job to do. Uh, and that's what he is doing with this war. He thinks that's really working out for him very well. Um, mm, he's got a shot of coming out of this advantaged. That's still not a zero possibility for him. But the historical image, if you like, is Russia becoming a superpower via a kind of gambit that finds no answer from the West at a moment of Western weakness, something like that. Promotion given is saying, "Hi Vlad, hope you're well. If there is no dramatic military breakthrough for either side over the course of years, and the West continues to support Ukraine, how else can the war plausibly end? It can end with the end of the Putin regime." It can't end with Ukraine losing its independence unless Western support doesn't just decline, but declines dramatically. But in your hypothesis, that won't happen. So if the West continues firmly supporting Ukraine for years to come, at least to the level of giving Ukraine more than enough to keep its independence and um, maybe a few step giving Ukraine the possibility to go a few steps toward um, getting more than just independence, but still not giving Ukraine enough to achieve something like a full victory. Whatever that means, let's equate that with the regaining of all territories. Um, then what we're going to see is an independent Ukraine and a high prospect of a war that goes on for a long time. I mean, um, this is one of the really big challenges for folks in Ukraine at the moment, because to a good extent, the narrative of the Ukrainian government has been, let's all gather together for a giant push, and we're going to roughly think that this is a matter of a year and a half, or something like that. Um, the story, the legitimating story of the Ukrainian government's handling of the war needs to be, if you like, resubmitted to the Ukrainian people if it looks like this is a 2 to 4 year war as opposed to a 1.5 year war. That's going to be a very difficult adjustment. Um, and it's an adjustment that is going to force, if the war does increasingly become a stalemate, going to increasingly force the Ukrainian government to alter its rhetoric and sort of rebroker a different kind of deal with the people. That we're doing this for 3 or 4 years now, and we're not doing this necessarily to regain all of our territory. Um, so how's that deal going to work? What kind of problems is it going to raise? What kinds of issues that were kept off the table of politics as part of this consolidation are going to sneak back onto the table of politics because they can't be suspended for 3 or 4 years, or they can't be kept off the table in a scenario where you're not talking about Ukraine regaining all of its territories. So this is going to be a very difficult internal conversation um, for Ukraine. Meanwhile, Mr. Putin has every interest to make the war as perpetual as he can. Um, I think that the thing that we are still strategically um, uncomfortable with in the West is the understanding that it's not just about supporting Ukraine as long as it takes, but it's that how much we support Ukraine is going to be reflected in how soon the war ends and in whether it ends, right? So supporting Ukraine is not just something that is um, about us being there. It's also about us developing a strategy of how well we want Ukraine to do, right? Um, and this raises deep questions about what the hell we want to happen on that space, on the ex-Soviet space. What the hell we want to happen in Russia? What the hell do we want to happen in Belarus? Um, how scared are we of certain scenarios? Should we be scared of certain scenarios? Should we be scared of anarchy in Russia? Or should we be scared of Putin's nuclear threats? Um, what kinds of scenarios should we try to avoid on the Russian space? Are they as bad as they seem to be? Maybe they're not so bad after all. Um, is the Putin regime in its current incarnation as bad as things get? Or is there something much worse than that that we should be out there to prevent? Now, if you've been sort of following our conversation, my argument is that we're overstating that case about preventing worse things than Putin. So this is the kind of conversation that gets us involved in. Daniel, are you talking about demonstrating in Israel? Um, you've got a situation where you've got this extraordinary country um, that, in a certain dimension, is clearly a democracy, Israel, and in a certain dimension, it clearly isn't one because of the violent occupation. But if we put this giant point aside, then even in the sense that Israel is unqualifiedly a democracy, it is drifting in a dangerous direction. But what you're dealing with is a rather universal phenomena of early signs of the democratic game being broken. And so Mr. Netanyahu is wrong if he says that nothing of the kind is happening. That is what is happening, right? But you are in an early onset dynamic here, and that's very special. It's the stage at which this can be still prevented and if not fixed, then um, partially patched up, right? This is still a time where um, the problem is actionable, right? And some solutions are actionable, right? Um, this is very different to, let's say, the way the Belarusian folks were protesting in 2020. But this was really about a very entrenched, weakened, decaying, but a very entrenched tyrannical system. This is very much early onset authoritarianism, which develops while plenty of other democratic rituals and institutions are still working, and you can challenge it. And so that's a kind of a global game. And the game that you're in will be a game that a lot of countries who haven't experienced it yet will find themselves in over 5 to 10 years. We'll be endlessly talking about this, right? There's no reason why this a situation like this shouldn't happen in a major Western democracy too. Correction about what Kotkin was talking about. He was talking about Western, not European institutions. Okay. Russia is European but not Western. Japan is not European but is institutionally West. That's apparently what Kotkin said. Okay. Siana Chai. Rachel, thanks for re-upping that super thanks about Russians rising up, and we've just covered that. Liam, a philosopher's never allowed to say I don't know. Philosophers almost always say that about aspects of big and important questions, or at least they always live with the possibility of waking up tomorrow and letting go everything you're committed to. So it's a very radically psychologically destabilizing predicament for which you need a kind of a strong psychological constitution to persist in it, right? There are certain philosophical opinions I hold very strongly. I'm psychically ready to discard them tomorrow. And that's without becoming disengaged from them, right? That's without becoming um, sort of ironically detached from them. There's a strange blend of engagement, attachment, but at the same time, readiness to openness, readiness to let go. So, and I think I don't know is a very, very important answer. Robbie is asking if Putin were to challenge Article 5, which country could he attack? the country that he thinks NATO will be least likely to mobilize around. Historical thought is always a Baltic country. I'm not an unqualified fan of Adam Curtis. Could you say something about the special Russian soul um, talk that people sometimes come across? So um, I received a comment the other day, and it's an often repeated comment. Um, it's often repeated, but you don't get oceans of it because we actually have very few Russian viewers, very few Russian viewers in Russia in particular. But the comment roughly said, um, this guy does not know the Russian soul, and therefore he can't understand Mr. Putin. Now, Mr. Putin, if there were such a thing as the Russian soul, would be a kind of a pestilence and a disgrace onto it. Um, but the point is that applying the term Russian soul to politics is almost always an expression of either evasive reactionariness or depoliticization, or both, right? If you need to talk about the Russian soul in connection with um, making sense of Putin's policies, um, you've got a problem with your sense of reality. Now, that doesn't mean, as we'll discuss hopefully tomorrow, that you can't make cultural generalizations about Russia. But that expression, even used, as it were, in a casual pub conversation, is always going to obscure more than it reveals. Sean's asking, to continue your fantasy, which and how many Russian cities need to be constructively organized? And is the intrastate media as isolated as the interstate media is from the West to prevent this? Sean, is that a question? Much love back at you. Is that a question about Russia breaking up? Or is that a question about the Russian population mobilizing and politicizing? Or is that a question about bits of the Russian military refusing to fight um, and taking political grievances to their local governors? And conceivably, you imagining some scenario under which one of them really takes them up. Um, the global thing to say here, I think, and I'm at risk of not understanding your question, is that Russia is obscenely centralized. There's the various corrupt people from Moscow are parachuted into regions, which they then run without understanding them. Not that they would be acting to the benefit of the region, even if they did understand it. Um, but that decentralization will break at some point. And to put this very cartoonishly, if it doesn't break, Russia will break. Um, the level of centralization is unsustainable in Russia. Um, and you're either going to get federalization or the destabilization of the integrity of the country. I'm not sure if I've answered your question. Someone, you said that there is more than one issue that Russian propaganda can focus on when targeting Eastern Europeans than multiculturalism and democracy. Could you please elaborate on these um, other points? Okay. I mean, Russian propaganda, its ultimate ambition is directed toward the major Western powers. And sort of the cartoonish picture is here that if we can get the major Western powers to stop caring so much um, about exactly what happens in Eastern Europe, and if they can get preoccupied with their own internal tumults of various types, then we'll be freer to reassert our power over Eastern Europe. And certainly with those East Europeans who are convinced of the evils and imminent danger of Russian imperialism, there isn't a project of persuasion. That is just, well, when we're powerful enough, we'll be able to exercise influence over you because you aren't real countries. I think that is a fundamental conception in the Kremlin. I'm not sure how far that conception can be advanced by Russian propaganda. I mean, you can't really get very far telling East European countries that they aren't real. Um, but that's the conception in the Kremlin, that basically, roughly, um, until you get to the former, um, until you get to Austria and to the former West Germany, none of the other stuff is real. These are toy sovereignties, and toy sovereignties in the end don't last. So as soon as a wave of instability and decline comes across the West, the toyness of these sovereignties will be revealed, and we will be able to take um, action. So that's the sort of primary eh, mechanism of reacquisition of Eastern Europe in their fantasy land thinking. Um, there isn't the conception that they're going to persuade East Europeans to come running toward Russia. That is not what they think um, could happen. But what they are doing, quite certainly, um, in all the European countries in which they intervene, is trying to destabilize people's um, trust in democratic institutions insofar as these exist. Now, just because your democracy is in decline does not mean you're going to become pro-Russian. Not at all. You could be democratically lapsed and viscerally anti-Russian. And Russians, the Kremlin themselves, don't think enough about that as a possibility, as a possibility that can occur in multiple countries. Um, but the chief burden of the propaganda remains the postmodern story of questioning not just particular narratives, but questioning whether it's possible to distinguish between one kind of narrative or another um, at all. So it's post truth propaganda, and beyond that, it's propaganda that ceases in a context by context, country by country manner to toxicify whatever conflicts already pre-exist. And so you need to proceed country by country, case study like with this. And what you're going to see fairly consistently is that the Russians are not trying to invent new conflicts as much as they're trying to deepen and toxicify whatever social, cultural, political conflicts are already taking place in any particular country. Franklin, are there actually any good arguments against using cluster bombs in Ukraine that are strong in of themselves? Yes, there are very strong arguments for not. Now, my answer is going to be different because this is the live I'm just going to be more unbuttoned with you. Look, but yeah, of course, there are strong arguments against giving cluster munitions to any country, no matter how necessary they are and how desperately that country needs them for its defense. And that's that the momentum against you know, the globalization of the use of these weapons is a bad thing, and momentum toward the minimization of the use of these weapons is a good thing. And that is why it can be at the same time true that it's right for all the NGOs to say, "What are you doing, Mr. Biden?" And for Biden to say, "I think that's a fair point for you to make, but my own fair point is we're a bit screwed about what lever to pull. This lever is available. Let's do it." So, um, I did a video about this, I think a few days or a couple of weeks ago on this channel, and I dramatically de-emphasized. I implied that I thought the argument for giving Ukraine cluster munitions was on balance preeminent, but I didn't emphasize my opinion on this because that's not really what you're here for. You're not. This is not up to me to judge this, but and also it's not healthy for you to watch a video from me which says, "Oh yeah, Ukraine should get it." Well, you've just watched 700 other tweets and comments which say that too. You don't need that from me. Um, but in the context of a live, yes, I do think that on the basis of the full balance of circumstances, it's a it looks like a very compelling move um, in pragmatic terms. But I didn't want to be the 749th person saying that, which is why I sort of de-emphasized that as part of the video that I made. Um, So no, I don't think the perceptions are irrational that are skeptical about this. But again, we're always in this really important realm of saying that an argument doesn't go away just because it's outweighed. You know, I have very good reason um, to I'll be frivolous now. Give a frivolous example. I have very good reason now to not be live and instead make a better quality video for you about the next topic coming up on the main channel. Um, but I also have reason to be here because I believe that nothing is possible without the process and without what we call the community coming back and routinely engaging by sitting around the table metaphorically with certain questions and so on. So do I do community engagement? Do I do better content? Well, I'm doing community engagement. That doesn't mean that the reasons for me to have spent this time making a main channel video instead have gone away. They've just got outweighed, but they're still there, right? So reasons do not go away just because they're outweighed. That is a very important part um, of understanding almost any debate where it's a debate that transcends frivolity, where one side has just nothing to it at all, right? And then what's also very important is that this business that reasons don't go away just because they're outweighed allows you to do something absolutely fundamental. And that is that realize that many of the debates that are worth having are debates that are not just between you and another person, but they're happening within you as well, right? Um, so uh, a lot of the conflicts that are happening between persons and between groups of persons are conflicts that are happening within persons. They're conflicts that are happening inside you. And often a conflict between Susan and Ricky about whether uh, carrots are better than broccoli. um, that conflict might look like Susan is saying broccoli is better and Ricky is saying carrots are better, but actually there's going to be a carrot broccoli conflict inside both, and there's going to be a pull in each direction inside both. But then with Susan, broccoli might prevail in that inner conflict, and um, uh, with Ricky, carrots might prevail. And so Ricky might take the carrot side, and Susan might take the broccoli side, but that conflict will also be happening inside them too. And that's really a dreadful example to give, but it's absolutely essential that we understand this connection between intra and interpersonal conflict in politics and in culture. Kristen is saying steak beats both carrots and broccoli. Um, well, I've been so connected with not just the medical world, but the sort of um, health science world, through my illness. And one thing that I'm vehemently against is this idea that there's a healthy diet for everybody. Diets are enormously individual. Thank you, James. I think that the number of people who say that they prefer the chat channel is really very high. The trouble is that the numbers don't bear it out. In other words, the vast majority of people who say they prefer the chat channel wouldn't have discovered the chat channel except for the main channel. Um, and so that's the kind of dynamic we're inevitably stuck with. I prefer this, but then of course the truth is you wouldn't know you prefer this unless that was the sort of the gate you got in through. And that of course raises an interesting question about how I balance this with these 3 hours a day that I work, because of course uh, this chat channel that we are on is a channel that just does not grow. It's a community engagement channel. So I'm doing 20 videos that are non-growth videos per every one video that might be, but often isn't actually a growth video either on the main channel. There's a fascinating balance. If I had more time or more help, I would rebalance it perhaps differently. But we are where we are, and this is all just beginning. We're just right at the beginning of our dialogue, which is very exciting. Um, do you believe Putin will attend the summit? My presumption is no. I don't think that he would be arrested, and I don't think that he's going to attend. But this is not my line of expertise. But the presumption is no Putin there. It's going to be headachy for more and more countries to deal with Russia. Russia is arguably a little more politically isolated than it is economically isolated. But its political and its economic isolation, though we have overestimated it and how far we could attain deeper levels of it, nevertheless, both types of escalation isolation are going to be increasing. Um, the people I'm trying to reach with this channel are people that I'm already connected with. So if you have seen more than 5 or more than 10 of my videos, this is what that channel is for. This channel is for. And this channel is also for the sort of what would be considered as naughty behavior in the algorithm. I mean, it's extremely naughty behavior in the algorithm to sit here and not show you pictures. It's extremely naughty behavior to slow things down and to just look at the ceiling and think, I wonder what I think about that. So this channel is for algorithmic transgression. Somebody's saying that Ian had a super chat. Let's have a look. Thank you so much. I really appreciate these reminders, and I'm really disappointed by the functionality in this chat channel. Live YouTube studio. Um, Ian, for pro-Russia Westerners, like Australians, Germans, any country really, what do you think they are in favor of? There are different things here. I mean, there are the left-leaning folks who are anti-Putin. I think that's really mostly what it is. There's very few people in the West who know the Putin regime deeply and say, yeah, I mean, that looks good. It's normally people who have no idea about how Russia works. Then there are folks on the anti-democratic right, not to be conflated with the pro-democratic right, although there's a bit of a melting of the border between the two that is intensely dangerous. So I think mostly we're looking at a picture of anti Putinism. I hope to share something about this dynamic on the left. There's already a video on the chat channel about Chomsky, but I want to share a kind of something more. So hopefully you may see that at some point in the not too distant future. The vast majority of such sentiment, actually on both the left and the right, is an expression of the crisis of trust in our democracies, right? And I love the fact that more and more of you are asking me, what can you do? And I, even when I missed that question, I enormously appreciate it. And I'm always putting it aside because I know how much energy I want to dedicate to taking us through these constructive questions about democratic regeneration. But mostly it's an expression of the crisis of trust. And so this is not really about an elaborate picture of the Putin regime with a positive evaluation attached to it. It's about questioning institutions, questioning the establishment, whatever that means. Not saying that's a vacuous thing, but we need to always fill things out when we put words on the table. Challenging the military-industrial complex. So the majority of this is a kind of Western anti-Westernism that in many ways can be grounded, but it can't be grounded when it comes to you implying that the Putin regime is a constructive project. The Putin regime is not just outrageous and brutal disaster, it's also a self-immolating disaster that'll blow up, even if it gets as far as challenging Article 5, which is what we discussed may happen in a few years, on the worst case scenario for us. The damn thing will collapse after that too. So in that sense, there is no way for Mr. Putin to win. It's just a question of how much damage he causes on his way down, and how much the self-immolation or the dismantlement of his project, how much damage that wreaks upon the world. But the question is really important, and I also don't want to overgeneralize. I think there are very different patterns of skepticism of support for Ukraine and softness on Putin. They're not the same, as I say, in left circles. Let me just quickly give you three sort of demos in which this is happening. So one demo is left. Another demo, bigger demo actually, is the post-democratic or anti-democratic populist right. And the third demo is kind of the alt left, which is yet another thing. So if you take somebody like Glenn Greenwald, he'd be cold left, but there's no sense in which he is left the way some socialist is who is opposing support in Ukraine. So there is a kind of an alt left, which can't be truthfully construed as being left, but it's rather a formation that has some overlap with what the intellectual dark web used to be, which is this now depleted and rather um, sort of uh, self-annihilated network of online discourse and online personalities. Um, but the alt left story is primarily an anti-institutional story that sometimes can be constructive, but often exploits the loss of trust in institutions. So the left soft on Putin attitudes. We'll say this much more elaborately and properly at some point. But the left soft on Putin attitudes in 2023 are roughly continuous, right, with what they may have been in 1994. But the alt left attitudes are different, right? It's a different demo. It's a different demo. It's a different culture, and it's an anti. It's an anti-institutional culture, anti-institutional conversation. Um, and but we don't be entirely dismissive of that bit either, because there's folks in there who may ask some constructive questions too. But we'll talk about all of that. Someone is asking, can you, someone as in someone, can you help me on how to explain to my fellow East Europeans, hard, right, to generalize, fellow East Europeans, how to stop thinking that the Russian comeback is inevitable? Many tend to think we cannot stop that. Well, again, where that's coming from, it's going to depend on the context. I mean, one idea is a kind of descendant of Sovietology, if you like, which tends to um, exaggerate Russia's power and Russia's staying power, right? And that underestimates the degree to which it is what we've just said repeatedly in this chat, it is, which is a sort of self-immolating empire. So if this thing is on the way down, and we are disciplined about helping it on its way down, then it's not going to come back. My own personal view is that our policy today is doing a lot to minimize the chance of a Putin comeback without eliminating it as a possibility altogether. John's son is saying, isn't it silly to think that just the very concept of democracy can save society? I think that if what we mean by that is the idea that simply moral galvanizing of energy in the West could save our democracy, that would be an illusion. And therefore, the story, which goes like this, look at the constructiveness of Ukraine's mobilization, and look at how Ukraine is fighting for values that we are partly giving up on. Isn't that embarrassing? Isn't Ukraine's um, courage here a wake up call for us to return and properly face up to what our values really are? I think that story is real, but it's massively overestimated. Because the key trouble for us is not sort of moral impotence, it's various kinds of social forces that, as I keep saying somewhat evasively, because I want to have real conversations about this that are more systematic, pulling our societies apart. Making the sustenance of trust and cooperation harder, making the sustenance of values like citizen belonging and the public good harder to sustain. So this is not a crisis of moral failure in the first and second and third instance. There's a lot of somewhat um, mm, uh, hawkish conservative people, or somewhat unreflective and unself-critical liberal centrist people on Twitter who are talking about the need to morally regalvanize ourselves. Well, I'm sorry, mates, but our problems are deeper than that. And that's why an honest conversation about the capacity and incapacity of our democracies is going to be the only thing that lands us onto a more realistic path about um, uh, what genuine possibilities of the path of exploring what genuine possibilities of democratic regeneration are available. What do I think of foreign fighters in the war? Um, it's a fascinating question. Um, and one of the things this raises is, of course, a question of the connection between um, uh, cleanliness of intent and the goodness of the cause, right? Um, you could go and fight in Ukraine and potentially make a difference um, while doing it out of some enterprise of self-rescue. I often just make a very simple broccoli soup, but the broccoli has to be high quality and fresh. Um, broccoli, water, and then you know a little bit of simmering, and then it goes into a blitz thing, and it just purees with salt, and that's it. Um, I would be closer, Chris. I'd be closer to being vegan if I were um, less sick. Um, it's impossible to generalize diets, but very, very crudely, on some cancer paths, you may want to be closer to being vegan. On some autoimmunity type paths, you may want to be closer, putting aside ethical questions and climate questions, you may want to be closer to eating almost a Joe Rogan type diet. Often that's called the Terry Wals diet. Terry Wals is an author of a famous diet for initially for people with MS, but now a lot of people use it. Oh gosh, I wonder how many people in this room know who Anna Kasparian is. I certainly can't answer the question of whether Anna has lost her radar. So Anna Kasparian is from the Young Turks, who are a huge um, online platform of um, commentary that you would standardly place to the left, but it needs quite a lot more elaboration than that. Um, I used to follow the Young Turks as part, which is that platform, um, primarily led by Anna and Cenk Uygur. But I haven't followed them closely enough to keep up with an analysis of it. Um, historically, um, um, historically, I felt that Anna's engagement with folks she vehemently disagreed with politically was unconstructive um, because it conflated what I call the crisis of agency, right? That leads people to distrust with just irrationality and disinformation and so on. So um, I think that um, that's one observation. And then historically, actually, the Young Turks were one of the online platforms that somewhat exaggerated the Russian interference in US democracy, unconstructively. again, because that takes away our lens from focusing what's really happening at home. And Russians certainly intervened, and we discussed how there's a risk of exaggerating that and exaggerating Trump's links with Russia as well. So those some of that. Um, Now, Rachel is saying something about trans rights. I haven't followed statements that Anna has made recently, so I cannot comment on whether I feel that they were appropriate or not. I'll certainly be at some point forced to do a quality breakdown of trans rights, trans discourse, simply because that's an important part of our culture and part of our culture wars. And it's very difficult to get a proper and balanced um, um, perspective on this. It's also terribly dangerous to discuss it, unfortunately, on YouTube as are other issues, um, because there's no transparency, right, about what kind of content can endanger your your channel. This is a problem. There's certainly nothing that I'm not fully comfortable saying when it comes to the key topics we engage in, but there are some other topics where um, actually in both directions there's a bit of instability. Can I actually say this on this platform? And that is profoundly um, destabilizing and conducive to a situation where you have people parroting an establishment line and people parroting uh, outrageous, deranged, conspiratorial rejections of it with very little in the middle. Yes, so I can't affirm anything about Anna's position. What I would say is that talent-wise, she's one of the most formidable opinion commentator broadcasters in the United States at the level of talent. Um, but that's about it. And so, as ever when it comes to, I mean, this is a kid, she's still in her 30s, I think. I am very, very slow to encourage a definitive sort of judgment on anybody at that age. It's always about encouraging people. Um, so we're going to see, but that's as much as I can say. I don't have a fresh analysis from the last couple of years. Um, Alexis is saying that Lex Friedman's interview with Benjamin Netanyahu has come out. I only watched about 5 minutes of that. Rachel, everybody is a kid under 45 or so, but not in moral philosophy or in some musical professions. There you're a kid until 65. There's a wonderful um, uh, pianist who is in her early 70s called Imogen Cooper, who's had a very magical role in my life, actually. And I think when Imogen is at her best, she's the best Schubert player today in the world. And all of that flourishing happened for her sort of in the 60s, really. And that's normal too. So, with some human enterprises, we're kids till we're nearly dead. And that's a problem. Yeah, I'm very slow to be critical of Lex Friedman. Um, I do think that it, Lex is not like a duck in water when it comes to distinguishing political from pre-political thought. Um, so he's just not a natural at this stage of his life. He's just not a natural political thinker. Um, but again, it's a baby. See Zeus, greetings from Prague. Missing Prague. Missing the Czech countryside, where I used to spend some time. Um, you're saying that you've got a problem to admit that there is some Russian sphere of influence, but when I do, I start to think if it is only a one-way channel. You cannot give a sphere of influence to um, a completely unconstructive, deranged actor who is foaming at their mouth and emitting genocidal rhetoric and engaging in ecocide and war crimes. Um, that that is not a conversation about spheres of influence anymore, I'm afraid. Um, so if you ask this in a terribly abstract way, um, then the answer is going to be um, a country with some imperial pretensions, aspirations, could exercise them in a partly benign way. Hypothetically, that's possible. It's hard, but it's possible. And I believe we're seeing that. I know a lot of you are not comfortable with that, but that's why I deliberately emphasize that I am comfortable to use the proxy war term about this war and say that the Ukraine war is an imperial proxy war conducted by the United States. Ukraine fights, America pays. And it's, in my assessment, benign and necessary, and if anything, maybe insufficiently confident assertion of projection of imperial power, right? So in principle, yes, there is got to be a benign or kind of at least impure conception of imperial power exercise. Nick is saying, I agree, everybody under 40 is a kid. So I personally tend to think that this is more of a crisis in certain Western capitals. And I believe that if you take, let's say, London, a 27-year-old woman in 1985 is a 45-year-old woman today in terms of maturity. And with men, it's worse. A lot worse. So actually, one of the fascinating conversations when we talk about our democracy, indeed, is this business of the crisis of men. Because you're hearing that conversation in circles you might not like, right? And you might think there is nothing to anything in that direction at all. But indeed, there is a crisis of men in the West, which is very serious indeed, and it needs to be detached from the woefully unconstructive ways in which it's being discussed by you know which kind of people in which kind of algorithmic bubbles. It's an unbelievable crisis of men. It's worse in some places. In London, it's out of control. Out of control. Which takes us back where? Cultural generalizations. It is possible to make some, and it is possible to make some about Russia. Look, the answer to what stance to take is that you've got to do different things, but one is don't give up on talking to what stance to take to prevent the decline of our democracy. Don't give up on talking to fellow citizens, even when it's unpalatable. So, sharing the table of politics has got to be a very unlovely enterprise, but a necessary enterprise. And as long as nobody threatens violence, it's worth persisting. And that includes local engagement too. Local political engagement is very important. And then you've got to watch like a hawk for political candidates that are out to break the democratic game. Political candidates who just are out to asphyxiate all media, who are out to asphyxiate the court system, who are out to create a situation whereby you can't vote them out. So what are the 2 or 3 stages? Now, sometimes you can't stop it, and people try. But what are the 2 or 3 stages that a country goes through to get to where Hungary is today, right? And what are the next 2 or 3 stages, right? So, and that takes us back to the protests in Israel and so on. You gotta be alert to this early, and that's why I am particularly clear with the British bit of this audience about where we are about this in Britain. So, with each British prime minister, each of the last three British prime ministers, um, I have said specific things about how each of them stood in connection with the destabilization of democratic institutions, right? And about each one, it's worth giving a separate and specific and non-lazy analysis. Um, so you've got to be you got to have your money on the ball now, especially with this new generation of entrepreneurial politicians who are not as intentional as, um, let us say, Mr. DeSantis in the United States, who are not as intentional about pursuing their goals, who are just drifting and might just happily and readily drift into anti-democratic directions, um, not because they're set on going there, but because they have um, such a limited tethering to the sacredness of democratic procedure and democratic ritual. Um, so that's very important. And sometimes it's a tough one to swallow because um, you might like somebody's policy on this or that issue, but yet recognize that they are an potentially or even actually an anti-democratic political actor. So I think, I don't know, I think we had an okay chat. Did we have an okay chat? Um, Let me take one last question. Um, what do you think about Kyle Kulinski and Crystal Ball? Um, let's take that question last, and then we'll let you go. Um, uh, Kyle has profound integrity. He's a very beautiful boy, and he is nowhere near losing his rudder. And it doesn't matter if he can get 7 things in a row wildly wrong. Crystal has integrity too. Um, Integrity is not enough to be okay. There's all kinds of problems with various kinds of algorithmic drift. But um, I think that so far, um, um, what I would say is that um, there's no degeneration of the personalities there at all, right? Which is what often happens to people online. Um, so um, I think that um, Rachel is saying Crystal's integrity is debatable. No, it's not debatable at the moment. That could change, but integrity in of itself does not mean, you could have integrity and then you could do 700 podcasts together with Russell Brand, and you're not a constructive interferer in the informational environment. So integrity is not enough, but it's there. Um, and then one of the things that came out, as Rachel quite rightly says, because we discussed this already, is that Kyle's show, Secular Talk, which is finally cracked 1 million subs recently after being stuck at 973,000 for so long, and Breaking Points, which Crystal does with Sagar and Jetty, which is in principle a constructive enterprise, a left-right enterprise. And then there is the podcast that Kyle and Crystal do. But what I commented on last time is that the problem for all such projects, one of the problems, is how do you do foreign policy? But you have to discuss it. But um, um, unless you have um, some kind of journalistic friction with different contexts around the world, you just can't do it. And the example I gave last time was um, Kyle Kulinski's conflation of Jeremy Corbyn with Bernie Sanders, who are very different politicians. You might dislike both or like both, but they're profoundly different in the sense that it's not inconsistent to like one but dislike the other. Um, and that's a minor illustration of the kind of thing that may go wrong in the way they discuss, for instance, the Russia-Ukraine issue, where there is just not enough friction with Ukrainian reality, with Russian reality, with what's really going on. There can be a kind of a placing of terribly abstract and um, rather inaccurate hats onto global political actors. And that stuff doesn't happen with a domestic policy discussions. You might not like what they say, but they know what they're talking about much of the time. Whereas with foreign policy is really difficult, is really, really, really difficult for such shows. It's just structured in like that. So there we go. Thank you so much for being with me. Thanks to Rachel for moderating today. Um, really appreciate, all of you, and catch you very, very soon, probably on this channel tomorrow. Thank you, Jessica. Um, and what I probably will talk about is this business of how Freud told Peter Pomerantsev that Russians are bad. Tongue-in-cheek way of putting it, the discussion that's coming up. Lots of love. Bye-bye, everybody.